It's hard to imagine the Navy without the aircraft carrier. These floating naval bases project America's power to the four corners of the earth, serving as a launch point for the world's most sophisticated combat aircraft. But how did it happen? What momentous event led to the transformation of the modern Navy into one so heavily reliant on air power? It actually had humble beginnings a century ago, when a small handful of men driven by their faith and ambition dared to dream and defied the odds. This is the story of how it all happened, how courage and ingenuity gave the United States what it would need to be a dominant power in the 20th century. This is the story of Wings for the Navy, a celebration of 100 years of naval aviation. Eugene Burton Ely was born in 1879. American ingenuity was advancing at an exciting pace. It was a time of invention, with breakthroughs in electricity, communications, and transportation technology. With Mabel acting as his publicist, he was flying his biplane in exhibitions.
After getting his airplane in Oregon, Ely started the circuit, and in June he was doing air shows in Minneapolis. At that point he was observed by Glenn Curtiss, who was always looking for pilot material to help sell his airplanes. He saw Eugene Ely and immediately hired him as part of his team.
It was an exciting time to be in aviation. Manned flight had captured the public's imagination. Like their counterparts around the world, both the U.S. Army and Navy were beginning to explore aviation as a weapon of war. Curtiss also realized the potential of the military as a market for his planes.
Glenn Curtiss took an early interest in aircraft designs that could take off from and land on the surface of the water, a design that he would later call the hydro-aeroplane and what aviators a few years after that would call the seaplane.
When Ely and Curtiss attended an October 1910 air meet in New York, they happened to meet Captain Washington Chambers, the Navy's officer assigned to administer aviation matters. Chambers was no expert when it came to flying machines, but it turned out he was well suited for the job.
Chambers had spent a lot of his career both at the torpedo base and at the Naval War College innovating in designs and engineering, as well as innovating in the policies and tactics the Navy was using at the time.
While Chambers was assigned the task of developing aviation, the Navy didn't provide much in the way of support for his efforts.
He had no staff, he had no fixed offices, he had no budget. Essentially, he'd been assigned to a position where he was supposed to explore something as long as it didn't cost the Navy anything but his time.
Unofficially, the Navy remained skeptical of aviation. 12 years earlier, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt advocated experiments on Samuel Langley's pioneering flying machine, but received little support. The Army, however, was exploring the military uses of the airplane. The Navy sent observers to a series of test flights in 1908, conducted by the Wright brothers at Fort Myer, Virginia. But the board maintained the position that naval aviation was something whose time had not yet come. The more Chambers learned about airplanes, however, the more intrigued he became with the possibility of naval aviation. But how exactly would the Navy use a plane? Chambers began to think outside the box.
He wasn't seeing a flat-top carrier as it is today, but I do think he definitely understood that if aviation was going to be useful to the Navy in the long term, it really had to develop in a way that would allow us to launch and recover aboard the ship.
The alternative, of course, was a seaplane. Curtiss had done pioneering work in this area at his headquarters on Lake Keuka in upstate New York.
In the context of the time around 1910, 1911, the Navy was based almost exclusively in harbors and river areas, so having an aircraft that was designed to operate from the water at the time made a lot of sense.
By the time Chambers encountered Ely and Curtiss at Belmont, New York, he was ready to try a takeoff from a ship. But how? Chambers had no money for this project, so Ely and Curtiss agreed to do it at their own expense. Chambers did arrange for the light cruiser USS Birmingham to serve as the launch vessel. workers at the Norfolk Navy Yard hastily constructed a wooden platform 80 feet long and 24 feet wide on Birmingham's forecastle. The platform sloped at 5 degrees with its forward edge 37 feet above the waterline. Ely's flight gear was a curious ad hoc collection typical of an enterprise lacking a budget. His headgear was a well-used leather football helmet. For a personal flotation device, Ely couldn't swim and was deathly afraid of the water. 2 bicycle inner tubes crisscrossed his chest. Without waiting for the ship to raise its anchor and begin moving, Ely took his place in the seat of the biplane, gave the signal, and revved the engines.
57 foot of roll with no wind across the deck. He gained most of his airspeed in the fall from the bow of the ship to the water.
Indeed, when the tiny plane reached the end of the platform, it plunged dangerously toward the water, only to rise just in the nick of time. The wheels, however, touched a wave, kicking up spray. Could Ely both take off and land a plane on a ship? Another test was quickly arranged. This one would be a greater challenge and would take place all the way across the country in San Francisco Bay. Curtiss, meanwhile, quickly responded to the success of the Birmingham experiment by taking the initiative with the Navy.
Glenn Curtiss offered not only a design such as his hydro-aeroplane that could operate where the Navy already was, i.e. harbor and river installations, but also was clever enough to offer free instruction in pilot training to both Army and Navy officers, unlike the Wright brothers.
The Navy quickly took Curtiss up on his offer. Early in 1911, Lieutenant Theodore Ellison was ordered to report to Curtiss's North Island facility for training and was later to be designated Naval Aviator No. 1. Before the Birmingham flight, Chambers worried the ship might run over the plane and pilot if the launch failed and the craft went into the sea. After Ely proved the plane could take off with the ship at anchor, there was now greater flexibility. When a wooden platform was built on USS Pennsylvania, berthed in San Francisco Bay, the platform was constructed aft, allowing for a longer and wider runway. Though the Pennsylvania experiment would be far more demanding, Ely went into it with a greater degree of confidence than the Birmingham experiment.
When it came to the Pennsylvania, he had the advantage. He'd done it once, he knew it could be done, and he also had a longer deck run.
On 18 January 1911, everything was ready. Ely took off in his Curtiss pusher from Selfridge Field, circled the bay at 1,500 feet, then made a slow descent toward the Pennsylvania. To slow the plane once it touched down, 22 parallel lines were stretched across the deck and attached to sailors' sea bags filled with sand at each end, with the lines about 12 inches above the surface of the deck. 3 sets of steel hooks were attached to the bottom of the plane to grab the lines as it touched down. At 11:01 a.m., having slowed to 40 miles per hour, Ely cut the engine when he was 75 feet from Pennsylvania's fantail. The pusher silently glided toward the center of the deck, snagging the lines and rolling quickly to a stop, dragging the sea bags after it. It was a perfect landing. In the moments following the landing, excitement broke out on the deck of the ship among those who witnessed the event. It was as though they could sense something momentous had just occurred. After having lunch with Mabel and a host of dignitaries aboard Pennsylvania, Ely took off in his pusher and returned to Selfridge Field. Though he might not have realized it at that moment, Ely had just demonstrated the possibility of the aircraft carrier.
In the context of the state of aviation at the time, wheeled aircraft were not really a benefit to a ship where platforms would obstruct guns and otherwise interfere with a warship's primary mission of employing gunnery at sea. And so at the time, it didn't look practicable to have aircraft that could fly on and off ships. However, because of Curtiss and his breakthrough work on developing the hydro-aeroplane, it looked like we might have an aircraft that could operate with the ship without interfering with the use of its guns.
Responding to a challenge from the Secretary of the Navy, Curtiss offered to conduct a third aviation experiment for the Navy, this one using a seaplane in San Diego.
On the morning of February 17, 1911, he took his new hydro-aeroplane design out to the cruiser USS Pennsylvania anchored in San Diego Bay, came up alongside, had the ship's boat crane lower its hook to a special harness that he had rigged, and was hoisted aboard onto the cruiser's boat deck. After he dined with the ship's officers in the wardroom, they simply reversed the process, lowering his aircraft back into the water, and then he returned to his camp at North Island. With this demonstration, he was able to prove that the new aircraft designs could in fact operate from any gunnery ship without interfering with the ship's main battery.
After successful demonstrations using both land and seaplanes, the Navy moved slowly toward developing naval aviation over the winter and spring of 1911. On 8 May, Chambers prepared requisitions for 2 Curtiss biplanes. One, the Triad, was to be equipped for takeoff and landing on land or water. Though these requisitions bore the signature of Captain Chambers and not the Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, this act on 8 May 1911 is officially recognized as the birth of naval aviation. Curtiss was busy training more naval aviators at his North Island facility. It was the beginning of a long-term trend of government-private cooperation in the introduction and development of new technologies. While Curtiss had filled the Navy's initial aircraft order in just 7 weeks, the pace of naval aviation developed slowly until World War I. After the war, the U.S. fleet shifted to California to face its next likely opponent, Japan. Aviation activity, however, continued on both coasts. In 1922, America's first carrier, Langley, was commissioned in Hampton Roads. But San Diego quickly grew in importance to aviation as well. Because it had a major naval air station on the water's edge, San Diego's North Island became the home for the Navy's fledgling carrier arm. There was also new aviation leadership within the Navy. Having given birth to a bold idea, Captain Chambers stepped aside in 1914 for a rising generation of naval officers who he had inspired. Following in Chambers' footsteps was Captain Joseph Mason Reeves, whose job it was to make airplanes a useful element of the fleet. Building on the work of Reeves and the Langley, the Lexington and Saratoga and their North Island-based air groups revolutionized naval exercises, including successful mock air raids on the Panama Canal and Pearl Harbor. Dive bombing and new fighter tactics were developed in the San Diego region, making carrier aviation a lethal threat to land as well as naval targets. Carrier aviation rapidly became a prestige arm of the Navy, and senior surface officers like Ernest King and William Halsey earned their wings to get a carrier command. By 1935, San Diego was the home to all 4 of the Navy's carriers when the USS Ranger, America's first purpose-built carrier, joined her 3 sisters. When war finally came to the Pacific, innovations in dive bombing and fighter tactics perfected over San Diego's waters contributed to victories at Coral Sea and Midway. With America's industrial might fully engaged and employing the sound doctrine established in San Diego, powerful carrier task groups roamed the Pacific, covering the amphibious advance, battering the Japanese fleet, and eventually striking the Japanese home islands. Throughout the long Cold War that followed victory, San Diego sustained naval aviation during the demanding transition to jet aircraft and combat in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, as well as reinvigorating fighter tactics with the Top Gun School at Miramar. The story of naval aviation has many heroes. They include Captain Washington Chambers, who early on recognized aviation's vast potential; Glenn Curtiss, an industrialist who was able to turn a vision into reality; Eugene Ely, a civilian posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for risking his life in that first bold experiment. Their acts and those of thousands of others have led to today's carrier forces, a lethal weapon of war and keeper of the peace. Today, Hampton Roads hosts the Atlantic Fleet's carriers, while San Diego is still the home of America's carrier force in the Pacific. Together, a potent strike force defending the nation that is safer thanks to 100 years of technology, innovation, and personal courage, turning a simple idea, flight, into an unbounded capability for the United States Navy.